Good morning, everyone. It's a great joy and a privilege to be with you here at the New York Encounter. We're so grateful for all of the organizers and those who work so hard to bring us together. And I'm delighted to be here celebrating this Mass with some of my brother bishops, beginning with Archbishop Aousa, who is the Holy Father's personal representative to the United Nations. I first met the Archbishop when he was the nuncio in Haiti, and he did such extraordinary work there after the earthquake. And we know that his role here at the United Nations is so important to bring the voice of the Church and the Holy Father to the international community. We're also very happy that the Chaldean Archbishop Al-Melnona, the Archbishop of Mosul in Iraq, who is in exile in Australia, who is with us today, and Archbishop Stephen Reicha, the Bishop of Lansing, Michigan. And also, we're very privileged to have with us my fellow Franciscan, Father Pier Bautista Pisabala, who is the superior, the custos of the Franciscan mission in the Holy Land, which was the first province that St. Francis started when he started the order. So we're very glad to be with them and with all of our brother priests, deacons, fellow religious, and all of you, my brothers and sisters. St. John's Gospel is certainly the most theological. There we find a depth of reflection that goes beyond what we see in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. John's Gospel is written much later and represents the theological reflection and the work of the Spirit in the community of faith. It begins with the very same phrase that opens the book of Genesis, in the beginning. Genesis goes on to describe the 7 days of creation. John's Gospel gives us the 7 signs, 7 miracles that produce faith in the lives of Jesus' disciples. In the Scriptures, as in life, the order of things is very important. And the first miracle, the first sign, was the one worked at the wedding feast in Cana. I often tease my Protestant friends by pointing out how Catholic this miracle is. First of all, it's performed as a result of Mary's intercession. And secondly, it involves large quantities of alcoholic beverages. A few years ago, there was a terrible scandal in Italy. It was discovered that huge quantities of wine were being distilled in chemical factories synthetically. The story circulated about a very famous winemaker who on his deathbed wanted to speak with his oldest son before he expired. The young man bent over the bed and his father whispered in his ear, "Son, before I die, there's something you have to know." He said, "What's that, Papa?" He said, "You can make wine out of grapes too." Well, at Cana, Jesus didn't use any grapes, just the dirty water that people were washing their feet with. That, of course, was the sign that allowed his disciples to glimpse his glory and to believe. The whole thing, of course, is set in motion by Mary's words, "They have no wine." These words are not a criticism or an indictment or a catty commentary on the shoddy hospitality. "They have no wine" was simply a plea for help. Mary was one of those persons who always put other people's needs ahead of her own. And she was the first to notice the tragic circumstances. Mary was not one to be an innocent bystander. She was quick to respond to people's needs. Luke's gospel said that when Mary heard about her cousin Elizabeth's pregnancy, she went with haste and spent 3 months taking care of the old lady who was pregnant. They have no wine. There are times when we could all identify with this phrase. We all have those moments when we feel that our life has run out of wine, has run out of joy, has run out of meaning. It's a time to resurrect that great classical musical masterpiece from my youth. Does your chewing gum lose its flavor on the bedpost overnight? If your mother says don't chew it, do you swallow it in spite? Can you catch it on your tonsils? Can you heave it left and right? Does your chewing gum lose its flavor on the bedpost overnight? Here comes the blushing bride. The groom is by her side. Up to the altar, just as steady as Gibraltar. Why, the groom has got the ring, and it's such a pretty thing. But as he slips it on his finger, the choir begins to sing, does your chewing gum lose its flavor on the bedpost overnight? Well, has the chewing gum lost its flavor? Has the salt lost its savor? Are you out of wine? Has your marriage, your job, your studies, your life lost its flavor? At times like that, we can only turn to God and express to Him our poverty and our need. That's what Mary does in the gospel. And the cry of the poor pierces the clouds, and suddenly there's wine without any grapes at all. Too often for the Irish, whiskey is about self-medication. In the Scriptures, however, wine has the connotation of joy. The Psalms tell us that God has given us wine to gladden men's hearts. And Isaiah and so many of the prophets speak about an abundance of wine as one of the signs of the Messianic times. At Cana, Jesus turns 150 gallons of dirty water into the finest vintage, full-body, buttery, velvety, fruity-flavored, delicious wine. Indeed, the abundance, the superabundance of this miracle is part of the sign of God's superabundant love for us and His desire that we be happy, that we experience the joy of the presence of the Messiah in our lives. Now, there's a difference between having fun and being happy. Maturity means reaching that point in our life when we know the difference. Happiness is always about love, always about making a gift of ourselves. The fact that this, the first of the 7 signs in John's Gospel, takes place in the context of a wedding feast is very significant. James Thurber once said that the most dangerous food in the world is wedding cake. The wedding is an event that affects the whole community. And despite the joy and celebration, a marriage is something that is very serious. This is particularly true of the wedding feast at Cana. We have no idea who the couple was. They could have been relatives of Mary or Joseph. But they could have been Model, the tailor, and Zidel, the daughter of Tevye. Whoever they were, I hope they fired their wedding planner. The names of the young couple are not terribly important, but what they represent is crucial. For their marriage was to reinforce the great metaphor of the marriage between God and His people, between Christ and the church. The first reading from today's Mass describes God's people, captive in Babylonia for 50 years, when suddenly the Persians conquered Babylonia and allowed God's people to return home, to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Isaiah's references make it clear that God is rescuing His bride and of His affection for Israel is undiminished. The first sign is a wedding feast because Jesus, the Messiah, is the bridegroom. Monsignor Albacetti's favorite quote from the Gospel was, "How can the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them?" He wasn't a big fan of fasting. John the Baptist, even though he fasted, describes himself as a friend of the bridegroom. Christ is the bridegroom, madly in love with his bride, the church, ready to lay down his life for her. Christ finds his happiness in bringing joy to his bride. It's wonderful that St. Pope John Paul II included the wedding feast of Cana in the luminous mysteries of the Rosary. Indeed, Jesus' active ministry is bookended between two wedding banquets, the wedding feast of Cana at the beginning and the Last Supper at the Cenacle on Holy Thursday. Jesus is always the bridegroom, never the widower. He does not exist separate from his church. When Saul was persecuting the church on the road to Damascus, the risen Christ appears to him and says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul says, "Who are you?" And Jesus says, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." For to persecute the church is to persecute Jesus, and to love the church is to love Jesus. The bride and the groom are one flesh. Jesus is so united to his church. We have all heard people say, "Oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual," in an attempt to live a Jesus and me kind of spirituality. In reality, discipleship demands being part of a community, living out our faith in the church. I've always reminded people that we learn to be disciples the way that we learn a language, by being part of a community that speaks that language. We learn to be disciples by being part of the community of the church. Christ the bridegroom has left us the wedding banquet in the Eucharist, a reflection of the wedding banquet of the Lamb. Here, an even greater miracle than changing water into wine takes place. Here, our wine and our bread become the body and blood of Christ. In many of the parables, Jesus evokes the imagery of a wedding banquet, like the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins waiting for the bridegroom. One of my favorite parables is the one about the master who sends his servants out to invite people to the wedding feast. It's not an easy assignment, and some of them get roughed up. The new evangelization, in great part, is about inviting people to the wedding feast, bringing people back to the Eucharist. It can be a challenging task, but it is the greatest work of mercy that we can perform, bringing our brothers and sisters to celebrate with Christ the bridegroom. Another beautiful aspect of the gospel of the wedding feast of Cana is that here we find the Blessed Virgin's last recorded words in the gospel. Do whatever he tells you. In Luke's gospel describing the visitation of Mary to Elizabeth, we're told that the infant John the Baptist danced for joy in his mother's womb, like David dancing before the Ark of the Covenant. Just as the Israelites carried the Ark of the Covenant with them to battle and in their sojourns in the desert, so Mary accompanies us in our pilgrimage of life. We rejoice to hear her words. John the Baptist would have heard her greeting to Elizabeth, "Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you." The Gospels do not record much of Mary's words. However, what has been communicated to us is of great importance. The Gospel indicates that how, when God was knocking on the door of humanity, it was Mary who, in our name, opens that door when she says yes to God. Be it done unto me according to thy word. As Mother Teresa used to say, we need to give God permission to enter our lives, to enter our history. Mary's first word in the gospel is a resounding yes to God, giving him permission to come into our lives and into our history. Mary's last word in the gospel is the phrase that St. John communicates to us in today's account of the wedding feast of Cana. Do whatever he tells you. If Mary's first word in the gospel is yes, her last word in the gospel is telling us to say yes to God's will. And Mary is telling us to be doers of the word, not just hearers of the word. Do whatever he tells you. These are the words that I have on my bishop's ring. Quodcumque dixerit facite. Do what God tells us requires much faith and deep trust in God's will and in God's loving presence in our lives. To accomplish God's will in our life, we need the help and the solidarity of a community of men and women who share our ideals and are striving to do what Christ tells us. Father Giussani understood very well the importance of community and solidarity. I applaud your participation in this New York encounter, which witnesses to the importance of communion as the path to true liberation and human freedom. In today's gospel, the wine steward says something very prophetic. Most people put out the good wine first, and after the guests have been drinking for a while, they serve the poor vintage. Unfortunately, many people begin their marriage, their studies, their vocations, their career with unbounded enthusiasm and energy, with a beautiful idealism and a desire to truly make this a better world. But as time grows on, they grow tepid, cynical, self-absorbed, and materialistic. Our ideal must be one of a constant conversion and growth, so that our commitment to a life of prayer and service will allow us to serve the very best wine in the autumn of our lives. Because the guest of honor, the bridegroom, is with us, changing all the dirty water into the best Chardonnay. Find your vocation and live it. Do whatever he tells you, as Mary says. And at the end of your life, you will be able to hear the words, "You have saved the best wine until last." God bless you.